I never imagined my peaceful retirement from the federal bench would erupt into chaos when the Evergreen Estates HOA burned my grandfather's workshop to the ground, not realizing they'd just declared war on a former federal judge with connections throughout the justice system. How far would I go to expose the sinister conspiracy festering behind those pristine lawns and cookie-cutter homes? The answer would shock even me. The pounding on my door came at 6:30 a.m., jarring me from deep sleep. I'd been up until 2 a.m. reviewing legal journals. Old habits die hard when you've spent 30 years making life-altering decisions from the bench. Grumbling, I pulled on my robe and limped to the door, my old war injury flaring up as it always did in the morning. Standing on my porch was Gerald Whitaker, the Evergreen Estates HOA president, flanked by 2 board members whose names I could never remember. Gerald's expensive golf shirt was stretched tight across his substantial belly, his face flushed with what I'd come to recognize as self-important indignation. "Judge Harrington," he said, though nothing in his tone suggested respect for my former title. "We need to discuss the workshop situation immediately." I blinked sleep from my eyes. "Gerald, it's not even 7 a.m. What workshop situation?" "Your grandfather's eyesore," he said, gesturing toward the back of my property. "It violates Section 14, Paragraph C of our community guidelines. No outbuildings exceeding 100 square feet, without board approval." My grandfather's workshop had stood on this property for over 60 years. A master carpenter who'd taught me everything from dovetail joints to proper wood seasoning. He'd built it with his own hands after returning from Korea. When developers bought the surrounding farmland to create Evergreen Estates 5 years ago, my property deed had included a specific grandfather clause protecting historical structures, including the workshop. "We've been through this twice already, Gerald," I said, my judicial patience wearing thin. "The workshop is protected under the original property agreement. My lawyer confirmed it when I moved here after leaving the bench." Gerald's thin-lipped smile reminded me of countless guilty defendants I'd sentenced. "The board has reviewed the situation and determined that the grandfather clause only applied to structures in good repair. That building is a hazard. This was outright fabrication. I'd maintained the workshop meticulously, preserving my grandfather's tools just as he'd left them. It was my sanctuary, where I still built furniture for veterans' homes. A promise I'd made to my grandfather before he passed. "That's simply not true, and you know it," I replied, keeping my voice measured despite my rising anger. "The workshop was inspected last year when I renovated the electrical system. It passed every code requirement. We've issued 3 formal notices already," Gerald countered, flipping through papers on his clipboard. "Perhaps you've been too busy with your hobbies to check your mail properly." This was news to me. I'd received no notices whatsoever about the workshop. Before I could respond, a sleek black SUV pulled into my driveway. The woman who emerged moved with military precision, her posture ramrod straight despite her gray hair. Captain Eleanor Ramirez, retired Marine Corps, now my closest neighbor and friend. "Everything all right here, Judge?" she called, eyeing the HOA contingent with the wariness of someone who'd seen combat. Gerald's expression soured. "This is a private matter, Captain." "Just checking on my neighbor," Eleanor replied coolly. "Seemed like an awfully early hour for a social call." I turned back to Gerald. "I'll need copies of these supposed notices, and I expect this harassment to stop immediately." Gerald tucked his clipboard under his arm. You have 48 hours to begin dismantling that structure, Judge Harrington. The board has been more than patient. As the HOA representatives walked away, I noticed Margaret Chen watching from her driveway across the street. Unlike Gerald's open hostility, Margaret's expression seemed conflicted, almost afraid. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away and hurried inside. "What was that about?" Eleanor asked, joining me on the porch. "Gerald wants my grandfather's workshop gone, claims it violates HOA rules despite the grandfather clause in my deed." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Timing seems suspicious. Just after you agreed to help the Millers challenge their foreclosure." I nodded slowly. The Millers, a young veteran family 2 streets over, had reached out when the HOA began foreclosure proceedings over unpaid fines that seemed to multiply mysteriously. As a former federal judge with expertise in property law, I'd agreed to review their case pro bono. "Could be coincidence," I said, though my years on the bench had taught me that coincidences in conflicts of interest were rare indeed. Little did I know that by sunset, the workshop that had stood for 6 decades would be nothing but ashes, and the tranquil retirement I'd planned would transform into the most important investigation of my career. That afternoon, I pulled out every property document related to my grandfather's workshop and spread them across my dining room table. The grandfather clause was unambiguous. Pre-existing structures of historical significance shall be exempt from HOA guidelines regarding outbuildings. My lawyer had highlighted this section when I purchased the property after retiring from the federal bench 3 years ago. I called my former clerk, now a successful attorney. "Hannah, it's Judge Harrington. I need your opinion on something." After explaining the situation, Hannah's response was immediate. "They don't have a legal leg to stand on, Judge. That clause is ironclad. Something else must be driving this." My thoughts exactly. "Can you check if there have been similar disputes in Evergreen Estates? Pattern recognition might tell us what we're dealing with." While Hannah researched, I walked out to inspect the workshop. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the oak trees as I approached the familiar structure. My grandfather had built it after returning from Korea, his hands still steady despite what he'd endured in POW camps. The workshop had been his therapy, his way of creating beauty after witnessing so much destruction. Inside, everything remained as it had for decades, his tools arranged meticulously on pegboards, the workbench polished smooth from years of projects. I ran my hand along the bandsaw he'd taught me to use when I was 12. No hazard here, just history and craftsmanship. A knock at the workshop door startled me. Eleanor Ramirez stood there, concern etched on her weathered face. "Thought you might need these," she said, handing me a small case. Inside were miniature cameras, the kind used in covert operations. "Standard issue for my unit in Afghanistan," she explained. "Noticed some unusual activity around your property while you were out walking this morning. 3 HOA board members taking pictures, measuring distances." "That's concerning, but not illegal," I noted. "No, but this is." Eleanor showed me her phone. A photo clearly showed Gerald Whitaker opening my mailbox. Taking someone's mail is a federal offense, as I'm sure you know. "When was this taken?" 2 days ago, and it's not the first time. Been watching since they foreclosed on the Millers. Something didn't smell right. I silently thanked whatever fate had placed a retired Marine Corps intelligence officer next door. "Would you be willing to make a formal statement about what you've observed?" "Already documented everything. Dates, times, photographs. Once a Marine, always a Marine. We keep our recon thorough. We installed the cameras discreetly, two covering the workshop from different angles, another facing the driveway. As we finished, a car slowed in front of my house. Margaret Chen, looking nervous, then driving away quickly when she noticed us watching. "She's on the financial committee," Eleanor noted, "but doesn't seem like the others." My phone buzzed with a text from Hannah. "Found something. 5 cases in 3 years, all properties with grandfather clauses. All ended in foreclosure after owners couldn't pay mounting fines. All purchased by Whitaker Properties LLC. The pieces started connecting. Gerald wasn't just the HOA president. He was using the position to acquire valuable properties through manipulated foreclosures. I called the county records office, speaking to a clerk I'd known for years. "Judith, I need information on properties purchased by Whitaker Properties LLC in the last 5 years, and any connection to a company called Evergreen Development." While waiting for Judith's research, I reviewed the HOA financial statements available to all residents online. Something caught my eye: large expenditures for community infrastructure maintenance that didn't match the actual work performed. As a judge who'd handled countless financial fraud cases, the discrepancy was glaring. Eleanor returned at dusk, her expression grim. "You're being watched." Black sedan, 2 men, parked at the community center with a clear view of your property. "Professional. Surveillance, definitely not law enforcement," she confirmed. "Private, expensive, the kind corporations hire when they're worried about litigation." My suspicions deepened. This went beyond petty HOA politics. When Judith called back, her information confirmed it. Whitaker Properties has purchased 7 foreclosed properties in Evergreen Estates, all resold to Evergreen Development at significant markup. And guess who sits on the board of Evergreen Development? City Councilman Robert Prescott. The same councilman who'd recently pushed through approval for a controversial commercial development adjacent to Evergreen Estates. Land that would skyrocket in value if certain residential parcels were rezoned. Parcels that included my property and its protected historical workshop. As night fell, I sat in my darkened living room, watching the street through the blinds. The sedan Eleanor had spotted remained in position. My phone rang. Hannah again. "Judge, the Millers weren't the only veterans targeted. 3 of the 5 foreclosures were veteran families who challenged HOA decisions. The other 2 were elderly, residents without resources to fight back. The targeting of veterans raised this from suspicious to unconscionable." Before I could respond, my security system chimed. Motion detected at the workshop. On my phone screen, the camera feed showed 3 figures approaching the structure. One carried what looked like gas cans. I immediately dialed 911. Then Eleanor. "They're at the workshop now. 3 individuals with what appear to be accelerants." "On my way," she responded instantly. "Don't confront them alone." But as I watched the feed, flames suddenly erupted against the workshop's wooden walls. 60 years of history, my grandfather's legacy, intentionally set ablaze by people who had no idea they'd just crossed the wrong federal judge. I raced through my backyard in slippers and robe, the night air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gasoline. The workshop, my grandfather's sanctuary and mine, was already engulfed in orange flames that clawed at the night sky. Through the crackling fire, I caught glimpses of 3 figures hurrying away, disappearing into the wooded buffer between my property and the neighboring development. "Stop!" I shouted, my judicial composure abandoned. "This is criminal arson." One figure paused, turning just enough for the firelight to illuminate his face. Gerald Whitaker stood there, not with his usual smug authority, but with something colder, uncalculating. For an instant our eyes locked across the dancing flames before he vanished into the darkness. Eleanor arrived seconds later, moving with tactical precision despite her age. "Police and fire are 3 minutes out," she reported, then assessed the scene with military efficiency. "Too far gone to save. We need to secure the perimeter and document everything." She was right. The workshop was unsalvageable. Decades of memories feeding the inferno. I stood frozen, watching my grandfather's legacy reduced to embers, when Eleanor's sharp intake of breath pulled me back to the moment. "Judge," she pointed to the ground near the workshop's entrance. "They left something, half buried in the dirt." Was a small metal canister, not the gas containers the arsonists had carried, but something deliberately placed. A timer glinted in the firelight. "Don't touch it," Eleanor warned, her combat training evident. "That's not standard arson equipment, looks military grade." The fire department arrived with a police cruiser close behind. While firefighters battled the blaze, I explained the situation to Officer Martinez, a young policeman who seemed overwhelmed by the scene. "You're accusing the HOA president of arson?" he asked incredulously. "That's a serious charge, sir." "I have security footage," I replied, showing him my phone. The images were clear enough to identify Gerald and 2 other HOA board members approaching with gas cans. Martinez shifted uncomfortably. "I'll need to call my sergeant. This is complicated." "Because Councilman Prescott is involved?" I asked, watching his reaction carefully. The officer's surprised flinch confirmed my suspicion. While Martinez made his call, Eleanor approached with Fire Captain Rivera, who held the metal canister in an evidence bag. "Not just accelerant," Rivera explained. "This is a military-grade incendiary device, illegal for civilian possession. Someone wanted this fire to burn hot and fast, leave minimal evidence." "Can you trace it?" I asked. "Serial numbers intact?" "I have contacts at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms who can run it." The night stretched into early morning as statements were taken and evidence collected. The workshop was nothing but a smouldering skeleton by dawn, 60 years of history reduced to charred timber and ash. Most devastating was the loss of my grandfather's tools, irreplaceable connections to his craftsmanship and memory. As the emergency vehicles finally departed, Eleanor touched my shoulder. "There's something odd about this whole scenario, Judge. Military-grade incendiaries to burn a workshop. That's overkill for a simple property dispute." She was right. This felt like scorched earth tactics, excessive force designed to eliminate not just a structure, but something inside it. Then it hit me. "The Miller's case files," I whispered. "I kept them in the workshop safe, the documents detailing the HOA's systematic targeting of veteran families, the questionable fines, the procedural violations in their foreclosure, all stored in my grandfather's old gun safe in the workshop office." I hurried toward the ruins, but Eleanor caught my arm. "Too dangerous. Structures unstable. We'll need daylight and proper equipment." Reluctantly, I retreated to my house where Hannah had arrived, legal pad already filled with notes. "This is far beyond HOA overreach," she said without preamble. "I've been researching all night. Whitaker Properties has purchased 15 foreclosed homes across 3 developments in the last year alone. All developments where Gerald Whitaker serves on the HOA board under different names. How is that legal?" "It's not. He's using aliases, shell companies, and all properties get flipped to development companies connected to Councilman Prescott. After rezoning miraculously gets approved, we need to access that safe, I insisted. By noon, with a structural engineer declaring certain areas accessible, we carefully picked through the workshop ruins. The safe, designed to withstand fires, stood among the destruction like a blackened sentinel. The combination lock was damaged, but eventually yielded to Eleanor's surprising expertise. Don't ask, Judge. Classified missions require diverse skills. Inside, the miller's documents were scorched, but largely intact. More surprising was what lay beneath them: my grandfather's military service record and a sealed envelope I'd never seen, addressed to me in his handwriting. He must have left it in there years ago, I murmured, carefully opening the brittle paper. The letter inside explained everything. The land my property occupied wasn't just valuable for its location. According to my grandfather's detailed notes, geological surveys conducted during his time had identified something significant beneath the property, an aquifer access point crucial for any major development in the region. That's impossible, I replied calmly. I have security footage showing 3 individuals, including Gerald Whitaker, deliberately setting that fire. I provided Officer Martinez with this evidence last night. Warren's expression didn't change. Unfortunately, Officer Martinez's body camera malfunctioned during your conversation. As for your security footage, we'll need to confiscate your devices to authenticate it. Arson is a serious accusation against prominent community members. Behind the detectives, I noticed a black SUV pulling up. Gerald Whitaker emerged, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit I recognized as Councilman Prescott's personal attorney. "This is harassment," the attorney announced, striding up my walkway. "My client has filed a complaint against Judge Harrington for making false accusations. Furthermore, the HOA has documentation proving multiple fire code violations in that workshop. We have witnesses who observed Judge Harrington conducting unsafe woodworking operations late into the evening. The calculated setup was obvious. Someone with considerable influence had moved quickly to control the narrative and the investigation. I had faced similar tactics in my courtroom, powerful interests attempting to manipulate the judicial process. "Let me understand this," I said, addressing the detectives while ignoring the attorney. "You're suggesting I burned down my own grandfather's workshop, a historic structure with profound personal significance, despite having security footage showing the actual perpetrators." Detective Griffith, who had remained silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. "We're just following protocol, Judge. The fire marshal's preliminary report notes accelerant patterns consistent with both scenarios. We need to investigate all possibilities." Eleanor emerged from inside my house, her military bearing commanding immediate attention. "As a material witness to the events following the fire, I can confirm that Judge Harrington was inside his residence when the fire began. Furthermore, I observed suspicious individuals fleeing the scene." Gerald smirked. "Captain Ramirez is hardly an impartial witness. She and the judge are close friends. I'm also a decorated Marine Corps intelligence officer," Eleanor countered, "with extensive training in observation and documentation. My testimony has been accepted in federal court 17 times. Without challenge. The tension was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle, a federal government SUV with Department of Justice plates. My former clerk Hannah stepped out, accompanied by a tall man with the unmistakable bearing of federal law enforcement. Judge Harrington, Hannah called. This is Special Agent Donovan, FBI Public Corruption Task Force. He'd like to speak with you, and with Mr. Whitaker. Gerald's confident expression faltered. The attorney stepped forward immediately. My client has no obligation to speak with federal agents without proper notice. Agent Donovan smiled thinly. Actually, we've been investigating Evergreen development for 6 months. We have a warrant for Mr. Whitaker's electronic devices and financial records. He turned to the local detectives. This arson investigation now falls under federal jurisdiction as part of an ongoing corruption case. The power dynamic shifted. Instantly, Detective Warren backed away from my door, suddenly deferential. We weren't informed of a federal investigation. That was intentional, Donovan replied. Gerald tried to retreat to his vehicle, but 2 more FBI agents intercepted him. The attorney began a blustering objection that died when Donovan handed him a thick document, the federal warrant, presumably. Judge, Donovan addressed me formally. We received your evidence transmission last night. Your colleague, Judge Watkins, expedited our warrants based on the timeline of events and the potential destruction of evidence. We'd appreciate your continued cooperation. So my calls to former colleagues had reached the right ears after all. The investigation I'd initiated had connected with an existing federal case. As Gerald was escorted to a federal vehicle, his face contorted with rage. This isn't over, Harrington. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Actually, I replied calmly, after 30 years on the federal bench, I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Mr. Whitaker. Someone who believed his corruption was too sophisticated, his connections too powerful to ever face consequences. Without water rights to this access point, I read aloud, no large-scale development can proceed in the southern quadrant. My grandfather had protected the information, ensuring the water remained public resource rather than privatized. A car door slammed in my driveway. Through the window, I spotted Margaret Chen hurrying toward my front door, looking over her shoulder fearfully. When I answered, her hands trembled as she thrust a flash drive at me. I can't be part of this anymore, she whispered. They're not just after your property. They've been targeting veterans intentionally because of a legal loophole that makes their properties easier to acquire under duress. Your grandfather's land is the final piece they need. Why help me now? I asked. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. My son serves in the army. When I found out they were specifically going after veteran families, she couldn't finish the sentence. The flash drive contained what we needed: internal HOA emails, financial records, meeting minutes not shared with residents. The conspiracy was laid bare in their own words. Gerald Whitaker wasn't just the villain in my personal tragedy. He was orchestrating a sophisticated scheme that exploited those who had served their country. As Margaret left, Eleanor arrived with news from her ATF contact. The incendiary device was military surplus, reported stolen from Fort Blakely last year. They have a suspect, Gregory Whitaker, Gerald's son. Eleanor nodded grimly. Dishonorable discharge 3 years ago. Specialized in demolitions. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture far darker than a simple HOA dispute. This wasn't just about my grandfather's workshop anymore. It was about systematic exploitation of veterans. Corruption reaching into city government and environmental resources that affected the entire region. The next morning, I woke to find 3 unmarked police vehicles parked across from my house. Not local patrol cars. These were the kind used by specialized units. Surveillance, not protection. My phone had been suspiciously silent since I'd called several former colleagues in the Justice Department yesterday afternoon. Eleanor appeared at my back door, entering through the garden to avoid being spotted. "Your house is being watched from multiple angles," she reported, drawing on military observation techniques honed through decades of service. "And not just by the vehicles out front. There's someone in the Chen house, though Margaret isn't home." "How do you know that?" "Her car's gone, but her security lights activated twice in the past hour. Someone's moving inside who doesn't know. Her routines. I processed this information while reviewing the files from Margaret's flash drive. The HOA's scheme was more elaborate than we'd initially understood. They'd created a systematic approach to identifying and targeting properties, particularly those owned by veterans who qualified for special mortgage considerations. The HOA would begin with minor violations, escalate to fines, then manipulate the appeals process to ensure homeowners couldn't win. The final step involved legal intimidation that most families couldn't afford to fight. They specifically target veterans because of the VA loan structure, I explained to Eleanor. The acceleration clauses in VA-backed mortgages make these properties particularly vulnerable to forced sales once certain conditions are triggered. They're preying on the people who served their country. Eleanor's voice hardened, using their service against them. And my grandfather's property is their crown jewel, not just for the aquifer access, but because it sits at the geographical center of their planned development. I pointed to architectural renderings embedded in emails between Gerald and Councilman Prescott. Without this parcel, their entire project collapses. My doorbell rang, interrupting our analysis. Through the security camera, I saw Officer Martinez standing on my porch, looking significantly more confident than he had at the fire scene. 2 plainclothes detectives flanked him. "Judge Harrington," Martinez began when I opened the door. "These are Detectives Warren and Griffith from Major Crimes. They have some questions about last night's fire." Detective Warren, a sharp-featured woman with calculating eyes, stepped forward. "We have evidence suggesting the fire may have been accidentally caused by equipment in your workshop, Judge. Faulty wiring, perhaps." The local police departed, clearly uncomfortable with being caught in the middle of what was now revealed as a federal corruption investigation. As they pulled away, Hannah approached with a tablet displaying emergency motions she'd filed overnight. "We've secured temporary injunctions against all foreclosure proceedings initiated by Evergreen Estates HOA, she explained. "And the Veterans Advocacy Group I contacted is preparing a class action suit on behalf of all the families targeted by Whitaker's scheme." Agent Donovan rejoined us after Gerald was taken away. "Judge, we'll need your full statement and all evidence you've gathered. This case appears to extend beyond Evergreen Estates to multiple developments across the county. As the federal agents established a perimeter around my property, now for protection rather than surveillance, I gazed at the smoldering ruins of my grandfather's workshop. The structure was gone, but its destruction had ignited something more important: the exposure of a corruption scheme that had victimized dozens of families who had served their country. The federal investigation moved with remarkable efficiency over the next 3 months. Gerald Whitaker and 6 HOA board members were indicted on multiple federal charges: racketeering, mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Councilman Prescott resigned in disgrace when his financial ties to the scheme were exposed. The most Satisfying development came when the court ordered full restitution to all veteran families who had lost their homes. On a crisp autumn morning, a year after the fire, I stood before a crowd gathered on my property. Where my grandfather's workshop had once stood, now rose a new structure, larger, more modern, but built with the same spirit of craftsmanship. Today, I address the assembled veterans, neighbors, and officials. We dedicate the Harrington Veterans Woodworking Center. This facility will provide woodworking therapy for veterans struggling with PTSD, skills training for those transitioning to civilian careers, and a community space where the traditions of craftsmanship my grandfather valued can continue. Eleanor, now the center's program director, unveiled the plaque beside the entrance. The Millers, who had recovered their home through the settlement, cut the ceremonial ribbon. Inside, my grandfather's restored tools, painstakingly salvaged from the ashes and refurbished, hung alongside new equipment purchased with grant money. Sometimes, I realized, the most powerful form of justice isn't delivered from a bench in a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from standing firm against corruption, from refusing to surrender what matters most, and from transforming loss into a legacy that serves others. If you've ever faced seemingly insurmountable opposition from powerful interests, know that justice can prevail. My grandfather taught me that craftsmanship requires patience, precision, and persistence, qualities that serve equally well in the pursuit of justice. For more stories of ordinary citizens standing up against corruption and winning, subscribe to our channel. Remember, the system works when good people refuse to be silenced. Join our community of justice seekers today.